Argentina used to be one of the richest countries in the world. Even today, it has the second largest shale gas reserves in the world, as well as one of the world's largest shale oil reserves. As you can imagine, its economic potential is massive. But perhaps the most curious part is that Argentina's economy isn't doing well at all. 40% of its population lives below poverty. Its GDP growth is on a downward trend, and while global average inflation is around here, Argentina's inflation rate is here. So what went wrong? How did a country with such massive potential end up with such a weak economy? To understand Argentina's current struggles, we need to go all the way back in history. Up until the end of the 19th century and through the middle of the 20th century, Argentina was called the Land of Silver. This was largely because it had one of the biggest reserves of natural resources buried under the land. It seems as if the country was always destined to become one of the strongest economies in the world, and some might even argue that for a moment in time, it was on the right track to become one. In fact, in 1913, just 1 year before the First World War broke out, Argentina's per capita income was at 72% of the US. Later, while the entirety of Europe struggled economically during the 1910s until the 1950s, Argentina was rolling in cash. Its GDP was growing at a steady pace of 5% every single year. It had an endless supply of raw materials, including water, natural gas, and oil. It saw an opportunity in the war climate in Europe and began exporting meat, grain, and leather in conflict-stricken areas. In fact, by 1918, 38% of Argentinian exports were with Britain, 20% was with the US, 14% with France, and 5% with Italy. In fact, when the Second World War ended, the Argentina peso was among the top 3 most stable currencies in the world, alongside the British pound and the US dollar. At that time, life in Argentina was so luxurious that it was said that there were more cars per person than in France. War-stricken refugees from countries like Spain and Italy, in fact, turned to Argentina in search of jobs and economic prosperity. Even during the 1950s, Argentina's per capita income was higher than that of Germany. So, where did it all go wrong? For most people, there is one person to blame for Argentina's lost potential: Juan Domingo Perón. Perón had won the Argentine presidential elections in 1946 and immediately laid out his ambitious economic plans. He promised a third path between capitalism and socialism. He introduced what is known as corporate fascism. Under the system, the Argentine society would be organized into corporations that shared a common economic goal and were completely under the control of the state. Workers, employees, and professionals in any field were made part of state-controlled trade unions. This, as many historians would later remark, was one of the gravest mistakes Argentina would make in its economic history. The most cardinal feature of Perón's policy was profligacy, and one glaring instance of that was Perón's 5-year plan from 1947 to 51. This plan promised extensive public works, large-scale state investment, and overall prosperity, but failed to mention the budget required and exactly how Perón was planning to finance a plan of this magnitude. It wasn't a big concern for Perón. He was happy to take up loans after loans, go into debt, aggressively print money, and let inflation spur out of control. As you can imagine, the national debt increased as state expenditure rose. Within a year, Perón had tripled the state expenditure, and by 1955, he had doubled the number of state employees who were paid directly from the taxes received from the Argentinian people. Remember, this was also during the time when Argentina was plunged deep into national debt. Perón's family had pretty expensive spending habits, which became a source of controversy. His wife Eva, for example, used the state revenue earned from the sale of beer and grain for her personal enjoyment. Though she and her husband hosted several charitable events, they were held through public funds. The only way Perón could finance his excessive expenditure was through increasing the circulation of money. This bloated money supply meant that as time went on, inflation grew increasingly severe. And while Argentina was on the throes of national debt and rampant corruption, Perón imposed high tariffs on imports entering the country. Perón wanted Argentina to achieve economic self-sufficiency, or autarky. He also promised that this Argentina First policy would help increase worker wages and social benefits. So large debts were taken by the state to purchase gas plants, electric companies, a telephone network, and several companies that were later discovered to be completely inefficient. But Perón's role in Argentina's downfall has been, to a certain extent, overstated. The final nail in Argentina's coffin may have not been Perón, but the people who came into power after him. This brings us to the second reason why Argentina is still poor. Its leaders lacked the foresight and planning needed to determine what economic policies were worth taking. Every government that took control after Perón fell into a vicious loop of hyperinflation and deflationary measures. They also happen to have very short-term economic plans. For this reason, poor investment decisions and budget allocation were just one of the shortcomings of the Argentine government. One such instance occurred when Argentina purchased the UK's military system for 150 British pounds, which comes to around 487 billion US dollars today. At the time, it was celebrated as one of Argentina's finest achievements, but a couple years later, this purchase turned out to be a disaster. Another factor that eroded Argentina's economic potential was its own military. From 1967 until 1983, Argentina was under a military dictatorship that took upon loans that the country could not pay, and as a result, it went deeper into a debt crisis. The 1982 Falklands War, which Argentina was a part of, drained the country's resources. The increase in military resources required 450 million US dollars. By the end of 1981, Argentina had a national debt of around $37 billion, which it just simply could not pay back. As a result, Argentina defaulted. Argentina was forced to undergo a debt restructuring program. With the Inter-American Development Bank, it promised to reduce its debt levels by 2% each year. The 1980s decades was in some ways one of the toughest economic times that Argentina underwent. In an attempt to control inflation, the government froze wages and cut subsidies to its state-owned enterprises. By that time, people began to grow resentful of the economic downturns, so they turned against the government. In 1989, then-President Raúl Alfonsín was forced out of office. After this, a new president came into power, Carlos Menem, who brought with him an era of privatization, a pegged currency system, and manufactured prosperity. To get rid of hyperinflation, Menem believed that the best way would be to peg the Argentina peso to the US dollar at 1-to-1. But of course, it wasn't easy to maintain this fixed exchange rate. As a result, Menem cut social spending and privatized industries. But one thing he did not reduce was state expenditure, which was already overspending and between 1992 and 1999 rose by a full 50%. By 2001, Argentina was in a debt of $178 billion. That same year, Argentina declared bankruptcy. Since then, the country has scared off any possible foreign investor, and the IMF bailout packages seem to only work in the short run. Here, you can spot the fourth reason why Argentina remains a poor country: its unstable political system. Argentina has had a slightly unusual number of regime changes. In one instance between 2001 and 2002, Argentina went through 5 presidents in a matter of 2 weeks. It only ended when Eduardo Duhalde, the 5th person to be appointed, remained in the position until May of 2003. All of these regime changes led to radical and sometimes rapidly shifting economic policies. This means that there was no cohesion in economic policies and that most governments only aimed for short-term economic success to justify their 4-year performance. In particular, the governments between 1976 and 1982 brought forth economic reforms that were the most devastating in the long run. The government that came into power in 1976 faced issues such as hyperinflation, a negative balance of payments, and a substantial fiscal deficit. Their solution was to only have short-term solutions to these problems. However, these policies also led to a financial crisis and were later entirely scrapped in 1981. The frequent changes in government have meant that economic policies have remained unstable, something even being scrapped entirely once a new government came into power. As a result, today Argentina has a debt of around $450 billion. From 2021 to 2022, the annual inflation in Argentina jumped from 50.9% to 94.1%, a near double of what it had been before. There is one industry that prospered as a result of inflation: the black market for dollars. The US dollar is being exchanged for 1,000 pesos. That is almost a 200% gain in the value of blue dollars in just this year alone. At the same time, the real GDP dropped from 10.7% to 5%, as external debt rose from $267 billion to $276 billion. Argentina's primary economic weakness is its combination of heavy spending and low savings. Added to this, global economic trends threaten the internally weak economy. Global crises as a result of the COVID pandemic, Russia's war against Ukraine, and tighter oil and energy markets have had devastating impacts on an economy that was already so vulnerable. Today, 4 in 10 Argentinians live below the poverty line. Given the weak state of the Argentine peso, the economy is undergoing a dollarization program to achieve a stable currency. However, just to finance the dollarization process, Argentina is spending billions of dollars worth of foreign reserves every single week. As you can tell, this is a huge drain on its economy. It also doesn't help that the country is in a dangerous mix of political corruption and a lack of judicial independence, which creates insecurity for foreign investors. For example, former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner committed a $1 billion public works fraud in 2022 and was sentenced to 6 years. Such political corruption creates inefficiency and risk for foreign venture capitalists. After all, most people wouldn't want to put their money where there is no guarantee that their money is in safe hands. Today, the country finds itself in a tricky situation. While state spending has spurred to an unimaginable extent, the Bank of Argentina has tried to fight hyperinflation by increasing interest rates, which today reach 65.9%. This increase in interest rates, however, has also killed private investment in the country. The question is Argentina willing to forego investment to bring inflation under control? Despite the problems Argentina is facing, economic analysts believe that things are likely to get worse for the country. The IMF predicts that the Argentinian GDP will continue to shrink by 2.5% this year. Certain analysts also believe that it is likely that inflation might hit 200% within the next 12 months. It is unlikely that we'll ever find out what would have happened if Argentina had realized its full economic potential and if its economy had not been meddled with by incompetent politicians. If Argentina were to recover from decades of mismanagement, it would need to employ severe austerity measures. Even then, recovery is likely to be a very slow process for this country that was once dubbed as the land of silver.